The morning Amos Granger rode into Caldwell, Kansas with dust on his boots and a handwritten notice folded in his breast pocket. Nobody in town could have predicted that one simple request would turn the whole summer of 1882 upside down. He was not a man who said much. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by years of open sky and hard wind, a jaw cut from something stubborn and square, eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the prairie. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, and he ran one of the finest cattle operations in Comanche County, a spread called the Silver Horn Ranch that sat about 9 miles south of town along the Cherokee River. He had built it himself, post by post and board by board, from the age of 22 when his father had left him 40 acres and a broken-down barn. Now those 40 acres were 400, the barn was gone, and in its place stood a proper ranch house with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch that faced west, so a person could watch the sunset without turning their neck. What he did not have was someone to share that porch with. He tied his horse outside Donahue's General Store on a warm Tuesday morning in late April, and walked inside with his hat in his hand. Earl Donahue was behind the counter sorting nails into paper sleeves, and his wife Myrtle was arranging bolts of calico on the far shelf. 2 women from the Ladies' Aid Society were browsing near the pickle barrel, and they both looked up when Amos walked in, because people always looked up when Amos Granger walked into a room. He had that quality about him, not arrogance exactly, but a kind of quiet gravity, like a stone dropped into still water. "Morning, Amos," Earl said, setting down his nails. "What can I do for you?" Amos placed the folded notice on the counter. "I would like to put this up in your window, Earl, if you do not mind. And I wondered if you might also pass word along to Reverend Calkins, so it could be read from the pulpit on Sunday." Earl picked up the notice and unfolded it slowly, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. He read it twice. Then he looked over his glasses at Amos with an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine puzzlement. "You are looking for a wife," Earl said. "I am," Amos confirmed. "And you wrote here that you want a plain woman, a hard-working, sensible, plain woman." Earl set the paper down on the counter. "Amos, you have got 400 acres, a stone fireplace, and I happen to know for a fact you have got a root cellar full of smoked ham and preserved peaches. Half the women in this county would line up for you without any notice at all." "I know that," Amos said, and there was nothing vain in it, just plain acknowledgement. "Which is part of the trouble. I have had enough of being looked at like a prize stallion at auction. I want a woman who is interested in working alongside me, who is not going to be frightened off by hard winters or calving season or the fact that I am not a man who does a great deal of talking over supper. I do not need beautiful. I need steady." Myrtle Donahue had drifted closer during this speech, the way a woman does when the conversation becomes interesting enough to pull her away from calico. She wiped her hands on her apron and tilted her head. "What exactly do you mean by plain, Amos Granger? Because plain is a hard thing to put in a window notice." "Plain in the way that matters," he said, folding the notice back up and sliding it toward Earl. "Practical, not fussy. Not the kind of woman who is going to spend half her morning in front of a mirror when there is bread to be made and fence to be checked. A woman who knows what she is and does not make a performance of it." The 2 women by the pickle barrel were whispering to each other behind their hands. Amos noticed and did not care. Earl took the notice and tacked it in the window himself that same morning. Reverend Calkins agreed to read it from the pulpit on Sunday, and by Monday, the notice had been copied by hand and sent to 3 neighboring towns on the evening stage. The whole of Caldwell County was talking about Amos Granger and his peculiar request, and the talking was not unkind, mostly just the pleasurable sort of gossiping that a small town does when handed something genuinely interesting. The notice read, "Amos Granger of Silver Horn Ranch SEKS, a woman of plain and practical disposition for the purpose of matrimony. Applicant should be hardworking, honest, and unafraid of ranch life. Beauty is not a requirement and may be considered a complication. Inquiries may be directed to DONAHU's General Store or to the ranch directly. It was that last line, "Beauty is not a requirement and may be considered a complication," that set everything off. Grace Crawford read the notice in the telegraph office in Wichita on a Thursday afternoon, having borrowed the copy that the telegraph operator, a young man named Pete Marsh, had received as general news from Caldwell. She read it standing up, one hand braced against the counter, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a gray bonnet, and she did not laugh the way most people did when they first read it. She read it carefully, the way a woman reads something she is seriously considering. Grace was 26 years old. She had been teaching school in Wichita for 3 years, ever since her father had died of a fever and left her the sole support of herself and her younger sister, Ruth. Ruth had since married a decent farmer named Bill Hendricks and moved to Nebraska, which left Grace alone in a rented room above a dry goods shop, teaching 30 children their letters and arithmetic for a wage that barely covered her rent and her meals and a new pair of boots once every 2 winters. She was, by any honest accounting of the thing, extraordinarily beautiful. She had known it her whole life the way a person knows they are left-handed, as a plain fact that occasionally caused inconvenience. Her mother had been a Cherokee woman from the Indian Territory, and her father had been a Georgia-born schoolteacher who had come west after the war and never gone back. From her mother, she had inherited cheekbones set high and proud beneath dark, steady eyes, and a quality of stillness that some people found unsettling and others found magnetic. From her father she had inherited a love of books, a precise and careful way with language, and an absolute refusal to be anything other than what she was. Being beautiful had not made her life easier. It had made men behave foolishly around her, had caused women to treat her with suspicion before they knew her, and had resulted in 3 separate proposals in the last 2 years from men who, when she sat and talked with them for half an hour, clearly wanted not a wife but a decoration. She was tired of it in a bone-deep, very quiet way. She folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket and walked home thinking about it. She thought about it for 2 days. On Saturday morning, she sat down at her small writing desk in her rented room with the early sun coming through the window and wrote a letter to Amos Granger at the Silver Horn Ranch. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The final version was direct and clear and did not waste words. She wrote, "My name is Grace Crawford. I am 26 years old and I have been teaching school in Wichita for 3 years. I was born in the territory to a Cherokee mother and a Georgia-born father, both of whom are now deceased. I am practical by nature and by necessity. I know how to preserve food, tend a kitchen garden, care for animals in illness, and keep accounts. I am not afraid of hard weather or hard work. I should tell you in plain honesty that I am aware your notice specified a preference for a plain woman, and I am not that in the way you likely mean. I cannot change my face, but I am not my face, and I think a man who is serious about finding a sensible partner ought to be willing to have a conversation before making up his mind. If you are willing to correspond, I am willing to correspond. If you would prefer to look elsewhere, I will understand that also. Respectfully, Grace Crawford." She sent it on the morning stage and did not allow herself to think too much about it after that. Amos received 7 letters in response to his notice. He read all of them at the kitchen table on a quiet evening with his dog, a large brown hound named Biscuit, sleeping at his feet. 6 of the letters were from women who described themselves in ways that made him feel vaguely weary before he had finished reading. They mentioned their skills at embroidery and their ability to play the parlor organ, and one of them sent a miniature portrait of herself, surrounded by painted flowers. He set those 6 letters in a neat stack on the corner of the table. The 7th letter he read twice. Then he read it a 3rd time slowly, because it was the most unusual letter he had received from a woman in his entire life. He wrote back that same night. His letter was shorter than hers, which he figured was fitting since he was a man who used fewer words when he could get away with it. He wrote, "Miss Crawford, I appreciate a direct letter. I have received several that were not, and I found them tiresome. I have no objection to corresponding further. I will say honestly that the part of your letter where you said you are not your face struck me as the most interesting line I have read in some time. A man who can see past a face ought to be able to judge a person by what they write. Write again if you are willing. Amos Granger." And so they began. Over the following 6 weeks, letters traveled back and forth between Wichita and Caldwell on a twice-weekly stage route. Grace wrote about her students and the particular challenge of teaching arithmetic to a boy named Thomas Beale, who was brilliant at everything except sitting still. Amos wrote about the spring calving season and a particularly stubborn heifer he had named Dolars because she had opinions about everything. Grace wrote about the Cherokee language and the few words she remembered from her mother, the way her mother had taught her to read the sky for weather. Amos wrote that he would be grateful to know how to read the sky better and asked her to write down what she knew. She did. He read it and went outside and looked at the clouds in a new way, and then went back inside and wrote to tell her that it had worked, that he had read the sky the way she described and moved his cattle to higher ground before a storm came that evening. Grace sat in her small room above the dry goods shop and read that letter and felt something shift in her chest, something she had not expected to feel from a correspondence with a practical stranger in another town. She set the letter down on her writing desk and looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up and put it in the small wooden box where she kept things she wanted to keep. In Caldwell, Amos Granger had told exactly nobody about the letters. Earl Donahue, naturally curious, had asked once if he had received any promising responses to his notice. Amos had said he was still considering. Earl had left it at that, knowing Amos well enough to know that pressing him for details was like pushing a stone wall. But Myrtle Donahue was a different kind of operator entirely. Myrtle had a friend in Wichita, a woman named Dorothy Fells who ran the Ladies' Aid Society over there, and who was, as Dorothy herself would say, an excellent gatherer of information. Myrtle had written Dorothy shortly after Amos's notice went out, just to inquire whether anyone in Wichita had taken interest. Dorothy had written back with remarkable detail. "You will not believe it," Myrtle said to her husband over breakfast on a Wednesday morning in late May, in a tone that suggested she believed it completely and was enjoying it enormously. "Grace Crawford, the schoolteacher." Earl looked up from his eggs. "I have heard that name. Everyone in Wichita has heard that name, and not just because she is a fine teacher." Myrtle leaned forward and lowered her voice, even though they were entirely alone in their kitchen. "Dorothy says she is the most beautiful woman in Wichita, maybe in all of Sedgwick County. Dorothy says when she walks down the street men stop what they are doing and stare, and women study her face like they are trying to work out how God assembled it." Earl chewed his egg slowly. "And she wrote to Amos." "She did." Earl set down his fork. "He is going to have a fit. He is going to fall in love," Myrtle said, with the calm certainty of a woman who had been right about these things for 31 years of marriage. She was, as it turned out, completely correct on both counts. The letters had been going back and forth for nearly 8 weeks when Amos finally wrote the letter he had been composing in his head for 2 weeks. He sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening after church, with biscuit at his feet and a candle burning on the table because the sun had gone down, and he wrote, "Miss Crawford, I have a proposal to make, and I want to make it plainly. I would like to invite you to Caldwell. I would like to offer you the hospitality of the ranch for a period of 2 weeks so that we can meet in person and determine whether we suit each other for the longer arrangement we have been corresponding about. I will arrange for you to stay with Myrtle Donahue in town, which I believe would be proper and comfortable. I am not a man who makes these invitations lightly, and I want you to know that whether you are plain or otherwise does not change my respect for your letters, which I have read more times than I will admit to. I hope you will come. Amos Granger." Grace read that letter in her classroom after her students had gone home for the day, sitting alone at her teacher's desk with the afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. Outside she could hear the sound of Wichita going about its business, wagon wheels and horses and the distant bark of a dog. She read the letter twice. Then she sat quietly for a few minutes, the way she always did before making a decision, and let herself think it through clearly. She thought about her rented room. She thought about 30 students and a wage that would never quite be enough. She thought about Ruth's safe in Nebraska with Bill Hendricks and a baby on the way. She thought about what it would be like to look out a window and see 400 acres of grass instead of a street. She thought about a man who had written that he had read her letters more times than he would admit to. She wrote back the next morning and said yes. The day Grace Crawford stepped off the afternoon stage in Caldwell, Kansas on a warm Friday in the first week of June, everything that happened was entirely in keeping with the prediction Myrtle Donahue had made to her husband over breakfast a month earlier. The stage arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and there was the usual small gathering of people who always appeared when the stage came in: the postmaster's boy, a couple of old men on the bench outside the barber shop, 2 cowboys leaning against the rail of the saloon across the street. Myrtle Donahue was there specifically to meet Grace, because Amos had written to her and asked if she would take in a guest for 2 weeks, and she had said yes before she had finished reading the letter. Amos was also there, though he was standing a little back from the others with his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who has prepared himself for something, but is not entirely sure the preparation was adequate. The stage door opened, and the driver handed down 2 bags, and then Grace Crawford stepped out. She was wearing a plain gray dress and a practical bonnet, her hair dark beneath it, her movements calm and unhurried as she thanked the driver and turned to look at the town around her. For one unguarded moment she stood in the late afternoon light, and the whole street seemed to stop. The 2 cowboys across the street straightened up from their lean. The old men on the barber shop bench stopped talking mid-sentence. The postmaster's boy stared with his mouth open. Myrtle Donahue, who had been fully prepared for this, still felt the small shock of it, because some things you can be told about and still not quite anticipate. Amos Granger went still. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was, extravagantly and unmistakably so. It was the way she carried it, without awareness of the effect she was having, looking around Caldwell the way anyone looks at a new town, with curiosity and assessment, her eyes traveling from the general store to the church steeple to the livery stable, and then coming to rest on Myrtle with a small, direct smile. "Mrs. Donahue," Grace said, walking forward with her hand extended. "I recognized you from your husband's description in his letters to you. I hope the journey has not made me too terrible to look at." Myrtle took her hand and laughed out loud. "My dear, you could arrive covered in trail dust from here to Texas, and it would not help matters any. Welcome to Caldwell." Grace smiled, and then her eyes moved to the man standing a little back from Myrtle with his hat in his hands, and that very still quality about him that she had been trying to picture for 8 weeks. She had expected something from the letters, had built an idea of him in her mind the way you do with someone you have been reading for weeks. She had expected the steadiness, which she saw immediately. She had expected the directness in the face. She had not expected that he would look at her in that first moment with the specific expression of a man who has just realized that he has severely misjudged the scale of what he was walking into. She walked to him. "Mr. Granger." He put his hat back on, which seemed to help him collect himself. "Miss Crawford." He took her offered hand. His grip was brief and firm, a working man's handshake. "Welcome to Caldwell. I hope the ride from Wichita was comfortable enough." "It was perfectly adequate," she said. "The woman next to me had a very determined opinion about the proper method of making cornbread, and I have come away with 3 separate recipes. I consider it an educational journey." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one. "I hope you will share them. Cornbread has been a point of contention at the Silver Horn for some time." "Between yourself and whom?" she asked. "Myself and Biscuit," he said. He has no taste whatsoever and eats whatever I make, which means I have had no useful feedback for years." This time she did smile, a real one, and he was not prepared for it any more than anyone else ever was. He looked at his hat brim for a moment and then back at her, and his expression had shifted into something more careful and deliberate, like a man taking stock of a situation. Myrtle, watching all of this, was already composing the letter she was going to write Dorothy Fells in Wichita. The first 3 days were formal and careful in the way that two intelligent, cautious people are careful with each other. Myrtle hosted Grace at the Donahue house, a comfortable 2-story on the west side of Caldwell with a sitting room full of books and a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon. Amos came to supper on the first evening, and they sat with Myrtle and Earl and talked about the ranch and the town and the state of the cattle market and the new railroad spur that was rumored to be coming through Comanche County. Grace asked good questions. Amos gave good answers. Earl, who had expected to feel awkward, found himself enjoying the conversation more than he had expected, because the two of them talked to each other the way two people do when they are paying close attention, not just waiting for their turn to speak. After supper, Amos walked Grace around the town in the long summer evening, showing her where the church was, and the schoolhouse and the mercantile, explaining the layout of the town with the same practical clarity he used for everything. She listened and looked, and at one point he pointed out the road that led south to his ranch and said, "If you are willing, I would like to take you out tomorrow to see the spread. The wagon ride is about an hour each way." "I would like that," she said. "I should warn you," he added, "that Biscuit will be very interested in you. He is interested in most people, but he takes it to an unusual extreme." "I like dogs," she said. "Good," he said. Then, after a moment, "I should also say that I am aware you are not what I specified in the notice." She looked at him sideways, which from a certain angle was quite a sight, though he was doing his best to treat it as a fact of the landscape rather than something that affected him personally. "Are you going to hold that against me?" "I am trying to decide whether I wrote a foolish notice," he said. "You wrote an honest notice," she said. "There is nothing wrong with knowing what you want. You wanted practical and steady and unafraid of hard work. I believe I am all of those things, and none of them have changed based on my appearing here." "No," he agreed, "they have not." A pause. "You write a better letter than anyone I have ever corresponded with." "Thank you," she said. "So do you. For a man who claims not to talk much, you express yourself very clearly on paper." He looked at her. "I find paper easier than conversation in some respects. Some things are clearer when you have time to think before you say them," she agreed. They walked back to the Donahue house in the evening quiet, and Amos tipped his hat and rode back to Silver Horn, and Grace sat in the guest room of the Donahue house for a while before she slept, thinking about a man who found paper easier than conversation, and who had a dog named Biscuit who had no useful opinions about cornbread. The ranch visit the next morning was where things between them began to change in a way that neither of them had anticipated on their careful, sensible timeline. Amos came with the wagon at 8 in the morning, Biscuit riding in the back with his ears flying in the wind, and Grace climbed up to the seat beside Amos, and they drove south along the Cherokee River, with the Kansas prairie spread out around them in every direction, green and gold under the early summer sky. She asked about the land, and he told her about the grasses and the river, and the way the country changed from spring to summer, and she listened with the quality of attention that he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers, total and genuine, like she was filing everything carefully for later use. The Silver Horn ranch house was exactly as she had imagined it from his letters, practical and solid, with the stone fireplace visible through the front window and the wraparound porch facing west. There was a vegetable garden to one side that had seen better days, and she noticed it without comment. The barn was well kept and smelled like hay and horse. There were 6 ranch hands living in the bunkhouse, and Amos introduced them all by name, which she noted because some employers would not have. The oldest hand, A wiry Mexican man named Alejandro, who had been on the Silver Horn since before Amos inherited it, looked at Grace with a long, considering look and then said, in accented but precise English, "Mr. Granger writes many letters lately." "Now I see why," Amos said. "Alejandro." Alejandro smiled broadly and went back to the fence he was repairing. Grace looked at the vegetable garden more carefully after that. The tomatoes needed staking. The bean rows needed weeding. The whole thing had the look of a project that had been started by someone with ambition and then abandoned to the mercy of a busy man. She said, without planning to say it, "Your garden needs some work." "I know," Amos said, with the expression of a man confessing a fault. "I have not given it enough time. Between calving season and the fence line and a problem with the south pasture last month, the garden went to the back of the list." "May I?" she asked, looking at the bean rows. He looked at her for a moment. "You came all the way from Wichita to weed my bean garden." "I came to see the ranch," she said. "The beans are part of the ranch." She was already moving toward them, pulling off her gloves and rolling up her sleeves with the efficiency of someone who has done this before. He stood for a moment watching her, and then he went and got a second pair of work gloves from the barn and came back and started on the tomato stakes. They worked side by side for 2 hours, talking sometimes and quiet other times, and it was in the quiet parts that something real began to develop between them, something that the letters had started but that required proximity to become actual. She asked him how he had started the ranch, and he told her about his father and the 40 acres and the broken barn, without any self-pity and without excessive pride, just the plain story of how a thing had been built. She told him about her mother's people, about the Indian Territory and the treaties, and the way the government had been taking land from the nations for as long as she could remember, and she said it with a steadiness that did not hide the grief underneath it. "My mother used to say that a person belongs to the land the way water belongs to the river," Grace said, tying a tomato to its stake. "Not because you own it, but because it is the place where you become yourself." Amos looked at the prairie around them, at the tall grass moving in the warm wind and the ribbon of the Kaskaskia shining to the east. "I think that is the most true thing I have heard said about this land," he said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the prairie, and there was something in his face that was completely unguarded for that one moment, something that looked like love for the land and a very old loneliness at the same time. She turned back to her tomato steak and said nothing, because some moments are better left without comment. Biscuit, for his part, had attached himself to Grace with the immediate and wholehearted devotion that dogs sometimes give to exactly the right person. He had placed his large brown head on her knee at the first opportunity and looked up at her with eyes of absolute conviction, and she had scratched behind his ears and told him he was a very fine dog, and from that point on, he considered the matter of his allegiance to be settled. Amos noticed this from across the garden and said, "He has never done that with anyone who came to the ranch." "Dogs have good judgment," she said. "He let a horse thief sit in the kitchen for 20 minutes once without making a sound," Amos said. "His judgment is specifically excellent in cases that do not involve actual criminals." She laughed, and he heard it, and it was the kind of laugh that made you feel you had done something genuinely worthwhile. She had lunch at the ranch house, which Amos cooked with a competence that surprised her, though she supposed she should not have been surprised since a man living alone for years either learns to cook or starves. He made salt pork and biscuits and dried apple preserves, and they ate at the kitchen table with Biscuit lying across both their feet simultaneously, which required some creative foot arrangement. After lunch he showed her the books, the ranch accounts, in a way that spoke to the fact that he was genuinely considering her as a partner and not just as a person to admire. He talked about the operation with complete transparency, including a difficult year 2 years back when a drought had hurt the herd and he had carried debt through the winter. She looked at the columns with the attentiveness of a schoolteacher checking arithmetic and said, "You brought it back very well." "I had help," he said. "Alejandro knows cattle better than I do. I know land better than he does, Between the two of us we manage. That is a sensible way to run an operation, she said. He watched her looking at the books and said, "You are not what I expected, Miss Crawford." She looked up. "What did you expect?" He thought about it honestly before he answered, which she noticed. "I am not certain. Someone more like the letters, perhaps. The letters are careful and measured. You are also those things, but there is more underneath." "More of what?" she asked. He seemed to consider how to say it. "More feeling than you show at first. More humor. More fierceness, I think, under the practical surface." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother was fierce," she said. "She had to be. My father used to say she was the bravest person he had ever met, and he had been through the war." She paused. "I try to be like her. I do not always succeed." "I think you succeed more than you know," he said. The words were simple and direct and completely without artifice, and she felt them land in a way she had not been expecting. The 2 weeks that followed were not a formal courtship in the traditional sense, not with calling cards and chaperones and piano recitals. They were practical and busy and punctuated by work. Grace helped Myrtle with the Ladies' Aid Society's summer project, which involved collecting supplies for a family south of town who had lost their house in a fire. And in doing so, she became known to the women of Caldwell, not as the startling, beautiful stranger from Wichita, but as the woman who had spent 3 days making sure the Harker family had enough bedding and preserved food to get through the summer. She went to the ranch 3 more times in those 2 weeks. She finished staking the tomatoes on the second visit and showed Amos a method for preserving corn that her mother had taught her. On the third visit, she met the full crew of ranch hands and had a long conversation with Alejandro about the medicinal uses of prairie plants, which he knew a great deal about, and was visibly pleased to discuss with someone who was genuinely interested. On the fourth visit, which was the last Saturday before she was meant to return to Wichita, she came to help Amos mend some fencing along the north pasture and ended up spending most of the day in the field beside him, working and talking. It was late afternoon when they stopped at the fence line, drinking water from the canteen and watching the cattle move through the north pasture in the golden light. The prairie was very beautiful at that hour. The grass turned amber and the sky above it shifting toward coral at the horizon. "I do not want to go back to Wichita," Grace said. She said it quietly and without drama, the way she said most things, and she looked straight out at the cattle and the golden grass rather than at him. Amos was quiet for a moment. "Then do not," he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at her with that unguarded expression she had seen once before in the garden, and this time there was something more in it, something he was not bothering to conceal, because they had been honest with each other in writing and in person for weeks now, and concealment would have been a step backward. "I am not a sentimental man," he said, "and I am not going to pretend to be one. But I am a man who knows when he has found what he was looking for, and I believe I have found it. And I think it has very little to do with what you look like, though I will not lie and say I have been unaffected by that." He looked down at the canteen in his hands. "You are the most interesting person I have spoken with in some years, Miss Crawford. You are steady and fierce, and you have a finer mind than half the men in this county and better judgment than almost all of them. You made friends with Alejandro in one afternoon, which took me the better part of a year. And you are good to my dog, which I consider a character test of significant weight." He looked up. "I would very much like it if you stayed." She was quiet for a long moment. The cattle moved in the distance. Biscuit had fallen asleep in the grass nearby, his feet twitching in a dream. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I wrote to you," she said, "I was not expecting to feel anything. I was being practical. I am tired of my rented room and I miss having land around me, and I thought perhaps a sensible arrangement with a sensible man might be the most reasonable path forward." She paused. "I did not account for the letters being as good as they were, or for the ranch being what it is, or for you being what you are." He looked at her. "What am I?" "Honest," she said. "Truly honest, not just politely so. And kind to your hands, which not everyone is, and funnier than you think you are." A pause. "And the kind of man who reads a woman's letter enough times to remember exact phrases from it." He had the grace to look mildly embarrassed by that. "I did say more times than I would admit to." "You did," she agreed, "and I respected you greatly for saying it." He held out his hand to her. Not a handshake, just his hand, palm up, offered. She looked at it for a moment and then put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers carefully, like something he was not going to rush. "Will you marry me, Grace?" he asked. It was the first time he had used her Christian name without the miss in front of it, and the sound of it in his voice did something she had not anticipated at all. "Yes," she said, "I will." Biscuit woke up from his dream at that moment and thumped his tail against the grass 3 times, as though he had heard the whole thing and found it satisfactory. The news went through Caldwell like a stone through still water. Myrtle Donahue, who had been waiting for this development with the patient anticipation of a woman who knows she is right, told Earl at breakfast on Sunday morning with the air of a prophet whose prophecy has come in exactly on schedule. Earl congratulated Amos with a handshake so enthusiastic that it nearly unseated his coffee cup. Reverend Calkins announced the forthcoming marriage at the end of Sunday service, and the congregation responded with the kind of collective warmth that small towns give to a story they have all been following. There were a few voices that were less warm. 2 women of the Ladies' Aid Society who had harbored hopes on behalf of their own daughters made comments of the kind that people make when they are disappointed and trying to make it sound like concern. One said she hoped Amos knew what he was getting, marrying a half-breed schoolteacher from Wichita, and this remark was repeated to Grace by a third woman who thought Grace ought to know. Grace heard it with a stillness that was very like her mother's stillness, the stillness of a woman who has heard worse and has learned that her response to it says more about her than the remark itself says about them. She thanked the woman for telling her and said nothing further about it. Later, alone with Amos on the porch of the Donahue house that evening, she told him what had been said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Half the best people I have known in my life have been called something by the other half of the people who were afraid of them. Alejandro has been called names in this town for 15 years, and he has more skill and integrity in his littlest finger than most of those people have in their whole lives." He paused. "If anyone says anything like that to you again, in my hearing or reported to me afterward, they will find that I have a very specific and very cold kind of anger about that particular type of stupidity." She looked at him. He was not a man who spoke angrily often, and the quietness of the way he said it made it more meaningful than a shout. "Thank you," she said. "It is not a kindness," he said. "It is just the truth." "I know," she said. "That is why it means something." Grace went back to Wichita the following Monday to give her notice at the schoolhouse and pack her belongings. She wrote a letter to Ruth in Nebraska, telling her what had happened, and Ruth wrote back by the next possible post in a state of delighted disbelief that gradually gave way to genuine happiness once she had extracted all the details. Grace settled her accounts, said goodbye to Pete Marsh at the telegraph office, and packed everything she owned into 2 trunks, which was not very much and fit on the stage without difficulty. She was back in Caldwell before the end of June. The wedding was on the 5th of July, 1882, a Saturday, in Reverend Calkins's church on the main street of Caldwell. The church was small and whitewashed, and the morning sun came through the windows at an angle that turned everything golden. Myrtle Donahue had placed wildflowers in mason jars on every windowsill, blue and yellow and white, and they smelled like prairie and summer. Grace wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had owned for 2 years and loved, because she had no interest in acquiring a white dress she would never wear again, and she thought blue suited her better in any case. She wore her dark hair loose, which she rarely did, because Myrtle had said please just once, with the enthusiasm of a woman who understood beauty as a form of generosity to other people. Amos wore his best suit, which was dark and well-fitting, and he had his hat off and his face was clean-shaved, and when he saw her come down the aisle on Earl Donahue's arm, because she had no father living and Earl had been honored to be asked. Amos had the expression of a man who has accepted a fact intellectually and is now being introduced to it in full for the first time. He swallowed once and stood very straight. Reverend Calkins performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only a moderate amount of the usual speechifying. Alejandro sat in the front row next to the other hands from Silver Horn and grinned so broadly throughout the whole thing that it was almost distracting. Biscuit was technically outside, tied to the hitching post, but he had positioned himself directly beside the window and could be heard to express his opinion at various points during the service. When Reverend Calkins said Amos could kiss the bride, Amos looked at Grace for a moment the way he had looked at the prairie that first day in the garden, with everything unguarded, and then he kissed her gently and briefly and completely, and there was a little sound from the congregation that was the sound of a story arriving at exactly the right place. The celebration afterward was in the yard behind the church, tables set up with food that half the town had contributed, because that was the way of things in Caldwell when something worth celebrating happened. There was pie of 6 varieties and enough smoked meat to feed twice the number of people present, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar, and the dancing started before the sun had properly begun its afternoon decline. Grace danced, which surprised some people who had perhaps expected a schoolteacher to be more restrained. She danced with Earl and with Alejandro and with Reverend Calkins's bashful teenage son and with 2 of the ranch hands, and she danced with Amos twice, which was both times slow and unhurried, and the second time he said against her hair, very quietly, "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in a long time." She leaned back and looked at him. "Better than the stone fireplace." "Considerably," he said. "I am glad to outrank the fireplace," she said. He smiled, a real one this time, not just the edge of one, and it transformed his whole face into something younger and easier and very warm. She filed it away carefully, the way she filed things she wanted to keep. Ruth and Bill Hendricks could not make the journey from Nebraska in time for the wedding, but they sent a letter full of love and a handmade quilt in blue and yellow that arrived by post 2 days after the ceremony, and was immediately placed on the bed in the ranch house master bedroom, which was now Grace's room too. The first months of their marriage were the period of genuine adjustment that any 2 honest people will admit to when they think about their early time together. Amos was accustomed to silence and solitude, and a very particular way of doing things after years of running the ranch by himself, and Grace was accustomed to the rhythms of a schoolteacher's life, which were nothing like the rhythms of a ranch. There were mornings where they navigated the kitchen like 2 polite strangers who had not yet worked out the geography of sharing a space, and evenings where the quiet between them was companionable, but not yet fully, the comfortable quiet of people who know each other. What helped was that they had started with honesty and they kept it up. When Grace reorganized the kitchen and put things in different places, Amos said, 2 days later, "I cannot find the salt," without any irritation, just information. She showed him where she had put it and explained her reasoning, and they reached an agreement about where things lived. When Amos went out before dawn without telling her where he was going, which was his habit, and she found the house empty at 5 in the morning and was briefly unsure what had happened to him, she told him that evening that she would like to know when he went out before she was awake. He said he had not thought to mention it because there had been nobody to mention it to before, and from then on he left a note on the kitchen table when he went out early, and she put it in the wooden box with the other things she wanted to keep. The ranch work suited her in a way she had hoped but not been certain of. She had the kitchen garden producing properly by late July, and the preservation work she did through August, and September filled the root cellar with enough stores to see them comfortably through the winter, and then some. She kept accounts with a precision that impressed Amos, who was good at numbers but not methodical by nature, and she set up a proper ledger system that made the quarterly review considerably easier. Alejandro, who had initially watched the new arrangement with the careful observation of a man who has seen things go wrong before and is reserving judgment, had his judgment finalized on a morning in late August when Grace came into the barn while he was treating a horse's injured hoof, and she sat down in the straw and said, "Can I help?" and then listened to his instructions and followed them exactly without making it about herself or performing competence, just quietly doing the thing that needed doing. He looked at her afterward and said, "You are going to be good for him, I think." "I hope so," she said. "He has been good for me." "That is the right thing to say," Alejandro said with approval. The autumn came golden and the grass turned, and the cattle were moved to the south pasture for the season, and Grace sat on the western porch on the first truly cold evening of October and watched the sunset with a cup of coffee and biscuits head on her lap, and felt something she recognized after a moment as contentment. Not the performed contentment of someone trying to be satisfied, but the real kind, the kind that comes when the thing you are in matches what you are. Amos came out and sat beside her with his own cup, and they watched the sky go from orange to red to purple in comfortable silence, and after a while he said, "What are you thinking about?" "Your mother's vegetable garden," she said. "Did she plant it originally?" He looked at the garden, which was now considerably more productive than it had been in years. "She did. She had it going every summer until she died. I let it go after that. Too busy, and also," he paused, "also it felt like her space. I did not want to handle it badly." She looked at him. "That is a very tender thing to have felt." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "She did not have much use for fuss. She said the measure of a woman was not how she looked at a party but whether she could be counted on when things were hard." Grace thought about this. "I hope I can be." He looked at her with the directness that was his particular form of affection. "I know you can. I have already seen it." The winter of 1882 to 1883 was harder than most. A blizzard came through in January that lasted 3 days and dropped enough snow to close the roads and put the cattle in danger. Amos and Alejandro and the hands worked through the worst of it, bringing cattle to shelter, and Grace kept the ranch house running and the food coming and made sure that every man who came in from the cold had something hot to drink and something warm to eat. On the second day of the storm, she pulled on her coat and boots and went out herself to help, and Amos saw her coming through the snow and started to tell her to go back inside, and she looked at him in a way that made him immediately revise that particular plan. She worked alongside the hands for 4 hours in the snow and cold, doing what she was told to do because Amos knew cattle and she did not yet, and she did it without complaint and without drama. And when it was over and they had lost only 3 head from a herd of 300, Alejandro said to the other hands, "She is one of us, that one," which was the highest thing he knew how to say about a person. Amos said nothing to Grace directly about that day for 2 weeks. Then one evening by the stone fireplace he said, quietly and without making a production of it, "I am grateful for what you did in the storm. I want you to know that." She was darning socks, which she did with a focused competence that he had come to find extremely endearing, and she looked up from the sock. "We lost 3 head, she said. "I am sorry we could not do better. With a different woman on this ranch," he said, "we might have lost 20. She looked at him steadily. "With a different woman on this ranch, you might have had more help with the kitchen garden all summer and not needed me to save the cattle in January." He almost laughed at that. "Fair," he said. She went back to the sock and said, "I love this ranch, Amos. I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped in the fireplace. Biscuit shifted in his sleep by the hearth. "I love you," Amos said. He said it the way he said most important things, directly and without preamble, because he had learned a long time ago that the most important sentences were usually also the shortest. She set the sock down in her lap and looked at him, and there it was on her face, the thing that had been building since the vegetable garden and the fence line and the canteen and the hand held out open across the rail, that warmth she usually kept carefully tended but which now in the firelight in the privacy of their own house she let show completely. "I love you," she said. "I think I have for some time now." "Since when?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Since the letter where you told me you had moved the cattle to higher ground because of what I wrote about reading the sky," she said. "I thought, that is a man who listens and a man who acts on what he hears. That is a rare thing." He looked at her. "Since the letter where you said you cannot change your face but you are not your face," he said. "I thought, this woman is not going to waste my time or hers. That is also a rare thing." They looked at each other across the small, warm space of the sitting room, with the fire burning between them and the Kansas winter pressing against the windows outside. And it was the kind of moment that does not need anything added to it. By the following spring, the Silver Horn Ranch had a new season to look forward to in more than one sense. Grace discovered in February that she was expecting their first child, and the news settled over the ranch like sunshine, gradual and warm and thoroughly welcome. Alejandro found out before the hands because he found Grace at the fence line one morning, looking at the cattle, with an expression that he had seen on women before, and he was old enough to recognize. And she confirmed it quietly and asked him to let Amos tell the rest when he was ready. Amos told Alejandro formally that evening, as though Alejandro had not already known for 6 hours. And Alejandro clapped him on the shoulder with a force that rocked him sideways, and said something in Spanish that Amos did not entirely catch, but that sounded like approval. Myrtle Donahue came out to the ranch the following Saturday with more advice and opinions than any one person should have been able to carry on a wagon, and Grace listened to all of it with her characteristic patience, and filed away the things that seemed useful, and let the rest go quietly. Ruth wrote from Nebraska in a state of excitement so intense that her letter covered 6 pages, including 2 pages of detailed counsel about what to eat, what to avoid, and the specific location in Wichita of a doctor she had found reputable. Grace wrote back that the nearest doctor was in Caldwell, and she had already introduced herself to him, and found him perfectly adequate, and she would call on Ruth's Wichita doctor if the need arose, which she did not anticipate. The baby came in October 1883, on a Thursday morning when the Kansas sky was the particular clear blue of the deep autumn that Grace had learned to love, a blue so sharp it seemed to cut. He was a boy, healthy and loud, with dark eyes from his mother and his father's stubborn square jaw already hinted at in miniature. They named him James Crawford Granger, James for Grace's father and Crawford to carry her family name forward into the next generation, which Amos had suggested himself without being asked, and which had made Grace love him more fiercely than she had thought was still possible given how much she already did. Alejandro, who was present for the birth in the sense of being on the porch within earshot for the full 6 hours it took, met Amos at the door afterward and was shown the baby and said, very seriously, "He has her eyes, which is good luck." "It is good everything," Amos said, and he meant it in a way that went beyond the baby, though the baby was itself sufficient cause. James grew quickly, as healthy children do, and he was a child of the ranch from the beginning, crawling toward the barn at the first opportunity, and pulling himself upright against Biscuit's accommodating side and babbling at the cattle through the fence rail as though issuing instructions. Grace nursed him through 2 fevers and a croup that frightened her badly in March of 1884, and did not show how frightened she was except to Amos in the dark of the night when she finally came to bed after sitting up with the baby, and Amos held her without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. The summers of 1884 and 1885 were good years for the Silver Horn. The herd grew, and the land was well watered, and the accounts that Grace kept showed a profit both years that allowed them to take on a second ranch hand, and to put money aside in a way that felt genuinely secure for the first time. They also fixed the north fence line, repaired the barn roof, and planted a proper orchard along the east side of the property, 12 apple trees and 8 peach trees that would not produce in any serious way for several years, but that Grace had pointed to one afternoon and said, "We are planting those this fall," in the tone of a woman who had decided. Amos had helped her plant every one of them on a cool October Saturday, and Ruth and Bill Hendricks had come down from Nebraska for a week's visit, and Bill had helped too, while Ruth held baby James and talked to Grace about Nebraska winters and the second child Ruth was carrying and the particular tyranny of prairie isolation. "Is it lonely?" Ruth asked. "9 miles from town." "Sometimes," Grace said honestly, tamping the earth around an apple tree. "Early on it was, less now." She looked at the ranch house, at the porch and the stone chimney and the orchard taking shape on the hillside. "I have made it mine, I think, or it has made itself mine. I am not sure which direction it went." Ruth watched her sister for a moment with the specific look of a younger sibling who is measuring the happiness of the person they love most in the world. "You are happy," Ruth said. "Not a question." "Extraordinarily," Grace said, and she smiled at the apple tree with the particular warmth of a woman who means what she says completely. In the late spring of 1886, Grace wrote to Reverend Calkins asking if she might speak with him about the possibility of establishing a proper school on the south end of town, because Caldwell's existing schoolhouse was overcrowded, and the children south of the river had no access to it at a reasonable distance. She had been thinking about this for 2 years and had prepared notes and a modest proposal and a budget outline. Reverend Calkins brought it to the town council. The town council brought it to the county, and the county, after the usual amount of deliberation that county governments engage in, agreed to provide materials if the community would provide labor. Grace organized the labor with the efficient calm of a woman who had managed a ranch household, a kitchen garden, a root cellar, an accounts ledger, and a child simultaneously. Within 3 months, the new schoolhouse was built, and the teacher they hired for it was a young woman named Helen Prout, who was fresh out of the normal school in Lawrence, and who was exactly the kind of earnest and capable young woman that Grace took immediately under her wing in the way that good teachers do for the people who come after them. Amos, who had watched all of this with the quiet pride of a man who married well and knows it, said one evening, "You know you could teach yourself. You are better at it than most." "I have James," she said, "and the ranch and the accounts." "There is a school 9 miles away now," he said. "If you wanted," she looked at him. "Are you saying you would manage the accounts yourself?" "I am saying I have managed worse," he said mildly, "and I can hire someone for what I cannot do." She thought about it for a moment. "Maybe when James is older," she said. "That is reasonable," he agreed. The spring of 1887 brought 2 things: the second child and a drought that tested the ranch harder than anything since the difficult year Amos had described in his accounts. The drought came first, building through a dry winter into a drier spring, and by May the grass was short and the river was down, and Amos was making decisions about the herd with the careful grimness of a man who has been through it before and knows the way through, even if the way is hard. Grace was 7 months along with the second baby, and she managed the household during those months with everything she had, stretching the preserved stores carefully and calculating water usage from the well with the same precision she gave the accounts. She also spent 3 weeks in correspondence with a rancher in Colorado who Alejandro had mentioned as having survived a worse drought than this one and come out with his herd mostly intact, and she got enough information from that correspondence to suggest 2 specific changes in Amos's water management plan that he implemented, and which turned out to make a meaningful difference. He told her that afterward, simply and without elaboration, "Your water idea saved us about 40 head. Alejandro's contact," she said. "I just wrote the letters." "You wrote 4 letters in 3 weeks while you were 7 months pregnant and managing this entire household through a drought," he said. "That is not nothing." She looked at him across the kitchen table where she was sitting with her feet up because the doctor had been firm about that. "I wanted this place to survive," she said. "It is my place too." He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hand, which was something he did sometimes in private, quiet gestures of physical closeness that he would not have done in public and did not need to, because they were not public people. "It has always been your place," he said. "From the day you planted the beans." She laughed at that, which was probably not what he intended, but he was clearly pleased by it. "From the beans," she said. "From before the beans," he said. "From the first letter." The baby came in July of 1887 on a hot evening with a thunderstorm rolling in from the west that broke the drought as though it had been waiting for the right moment. She was a girl, small and dark-haired, and possessed from the first hour of an expression of absolute opinion that suggested she had a view on everything and was prepared to share it. They named her Clara May Granger, May for Grace's mother, whose name had been Maya, shortened to May because it fit the way the original did not quite in the world they were in, and Clara because Grace had always loved the name and Amos had said, simply, "Then that is her name." James, who was 3.5 and had been under Myrtle Donahue's care during the birth, was brought home by Earl the next morning and introduced to his sister with the solemnity of a very small person encountering something he has not been prepared for. He stood beside the bed and looked at Clara for a long time and then said, "She is very small." "She is," Grace agreed, "but she will grow." "Like the apple trees?" James asked. "Exactly like the apple trees," Grace said. James seemed to find this satisfying and went to report to Biscuit, who was in his usual position near the door, and who was informed of the new development in complete and grave detail. The years moved forward the way they do on good land, with seasons cycling and the ranch growing, and the family expanding into the space that Amos had built with his hands, and that Grace had made into something that held people rather than just sheltered them. James started at the new schoolhouse when he was 5, riding in with Alejandro on the supply runs twice a week, and he came home full of information about arithmetic and the names of rivers that Grace checked and added to, because she still had her schoolteacher's habit of going past the lesson. Clara was, from almost the beginning, her father's particular companion on the porch. She would sit beside Amos in the evenings with her small feet not reaching the floor and watch the sunset with the same quality of absorbed attention that Grace had first noticed in Amos and had come to recognize as one of the things they shared most deeply. Clara also had her grandmother's Cherokee quality of stillness, and Grace sometimes watched her daughter on the porch beside her husband and felt the long thread of her mother's people running through this child like a river finding its way. She told Clara stories about her grandmother in the evenings, the same way her mother had told them to her, and Clara listened with her dark eyes wide and serious, and sometimes asked questions that went straight to the heart of things in the way that children sometimes do. "Why did they take the land, Mama?" And Grace, who had her mother's honesty and her father's precision, said, "Because they could, and because they believed they had the right, and because the people whose land it was were not considered fully people by those who were taking it." And Clara thought about this for a long moment and said, "That was wrong." And Grace said, "Yes, it was. It still is." And Clara nodded, with the face of a child filing something in a permanent place. The apple trees bore their first real fruit in 1890, 8 years after Grace had stood in the Silver Horn garden on a warm October day and planted each one with Amos beside her. The harvest was not large, but it was real, and Grace made apple preserves and apple butter and a dried apple pie that Amos said was the best thing he had eaten since the last one, which was exactly the right thing to say. They ate the first apples from the orchard on the porch in the late afternoon of an early October day, sitting together as the sun went west and the Kansas sky went gold and the grass moved in the long, easy wind. James was 7 and Clara was 3, and Biscuit was old now and moved slowly but was still committed to his position between them. Alejandro was down at the barn with the hands. The ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet on good evenings, full but still. Amos bit into his apple and looked out at the orchard. 8 years, he said. 8 years, she agreed. Best 8 years of my life, he said, in the same direct way he said the important things. She looked at him, this man who had put a notice in a store window asking for a plain woman, because he did not think he needed anything that required more care than Plain, who had looked at her stepping off a stage and had had the grace to be honest about his surprise, and then the greater grace to set it aside and look at what was actually there. She thought about the letters in her wooden box, all of them, his and hers, every one of them kept. She thought about the beans and the canteen and the open hand and the storm and the apple trees and the children sleeping inside and the fireplace burning on winter nights and all the ordinary extraordinary moments that made up 8 years of a life built together on good land. The notice said beauty may be considered a complication, she said. He looked at her sidelong, with the dry humor she had learned to love. I stand by that assessment. It has not been a complication, she asked. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it genuinely. It complicated the first 5 minutes, he said. After that, it was just you. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, easy and natural as breathing. The sun moved lower. The apple trees stood in their rows in the evening light, bearing what they had been given time to grow. I am glad I wrote that letter, she said. I am glad Earl put mine in the window, he said. You were very specific, she said, about the plain woman. I had very particular ideas about what I needed, he said. Turns out my ideas were incomplete. What were you missing, she asked. He thought about it. Someone who reads the sky, he said. Someone who plants what she intends to harvest. Someone who works next to you instead of waiting for you to be done. He paused. Someone who loves the land the same way you do, so it is not a lonely thing. She was quiet for a moment. The light was very beautiful. James's voice could be heard from inside the house, telling Clara something with the authority of an older brother, and Clara's response was swift and unimpressed, the voice of a child who has her grandmother's spirit and her mother's backbone. It is not lonely, Grace said. It has not been lonely for a long time. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, briefly and without ceremony, and she closed her eyes for a moment. Biscuit sighed comfortably in his old dog sleep. The apple trees held their leaves in the evening wind. Out on the south pasture the cattle moved in the golden light, 400 acres of grass and sky and river, the same land that a younger and lonelier man had built post by post, board by board, from 40 acres and a broken-down barn, never knowing that what it was waiting for was not a plain woman at all, but specifically and exactly this one, who was anything but plain and everything he needed, who had come to him from a notice in a store window, and turned out to be the most useful and important and beloved complication of his entire life. The following spring, 1891, Ruth and Bill Hendricks came down from Nebraska for a month's visit with their 2 children, a boy of 6 named Thomas and a girl of 4 named June. And the Silver Horn Ranch was full in a way it had never been before. Full of noise and running feet and Biscuit attempting to herd the children with the energy of a much younger dog, and James taking Thomas on a tour of the orchard with the proprietary pride of an 8-year-old, whose mother has taught him the name of every tree. Clara and June found each other immediately with the recognition that small girls sometimes have, and were inseparable within an hour. Ruth stood on the western porch with Grace on the second evening of the visit and watched the sun go down, and she said, I worried about you, you know, when you wrote that you had answered a notice from a stranger in another town. I know you did, Grace said. You wrote me 7 letters about it before I even left Wichita. 8, Ruth said. I did not send the last one because you were already gone. Grace smiled. What did the last one say? Ruth thought about it. It said that you were the most sensible person I knew and also the bravest, and that if anyone could make an unconventional arrangement into something real, it was you. She paused. And then it said I would come down there myself and have words with any man who was not worthy of you. He is worthy, Grace said. He is more than worthy, Ruth said with conviction. He is exactly right. They stood together on the porch in the evening. 2 sisters who had been each other's closest family for years before the families they had each built, watching the sun go the slow, gorgeous way it goes when the sky is clear and the land is flat, and there is nothing between you and the horizon to interrupt it. Bill came out with Amos, and they stood with their wives and their coffee cups and watched the light fail in that slow gold way. And below them in the garden, the children ran in the dusk, and Biscuit ran with them as fast as his old legs would carry him. And the apple trees stood in the growing dark with the last of the light on their leaves. And the ranch was everything a place can be when the right people are in it. Grace and Amos were not demonstrative people in public. They were private with their tenderness in the way that some people are, not from coldness, but from the sense that the best things are for the people involved, and not for general observation. But standing on the porch in the last light with Ruth and Bill beside them and the children below, and the whole expanse of Silver Horn Ranch spread out in the evening, Amos took Grace's hand the way he had taken it on the fence line 9 years before, and she did not look at him and he did not look at her. They both just looked at the land, and their hands were joined, and it was more than enough. The summer of 1891 was the summer James found the arrowhead in the north pasture. He brought it home on a Tuesday afternoon, having carried it the whole 9 miles back from school with tremendous reverence, and he presented it to his mother with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who knows he has found something important. Grace turned it over in her hands, the smooth, dark flint worn to a fine point, and she felt the long, familiar thread of connection to the land, and the people who had walked it before any of them, her mother's people and the generations before her mother's people. She sat down with James at the kitchen table and told him what she knew about the Wichita people and the Osage and the Comanche who had ranged across this land, about what flint arrowheads meant and how they were made, about the history of this country that went back long before the cattle and the ranch and the railroad and the town. James listened with the quality of attention he had inherited from both parents, entirely focused, and at the end he asked, "Are those people still here?" "Some are," Grace said. "Some were moved, some are in the territory." "Like your mother?" James asked. "My mother's people are in the territory, yes," Grace said, "though your grandmother herself is gone. She died before you were born." James looked at the arrowhead which he was holding carefully. "Could we go there sometime, to the territory, to see her people?" Grace looked at him. It was a question she had been asking herself for years, in a quiet way, whether she could make that journey and what she would find at the end of it. Her mother had left the territory as a young woman, following Grace's father west, and Grace had never been. She had her mother's stories and her mother's words and her mother's way of reading the sky, but she had never seen the land her mother had come from. "Maybe we could," Grace said. She talked to Amos about it that evening, and he listened with his full attention and then said, "When would you want to go?" "Next summer, perhaps," she said, "if the ranch can spare us for a week." "The ranch can spare us," he said. "Alejandro can manage a week." She looked at him. "You would come?" "Of course I would come," he said, as though this were obvious. "You are my family, and that is your family. I would like to know about it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned it over and held hers the way he had learned to do, easy and complete. They made the journey to the Indian Territory in the late spring of 1892, all 4 of them, Grace and Amos and James and Clara, in the wagon with supplies for 2 weeks, and a letter of introduction that Grace had arranged through a church contact, who knew one of the Cherokee missionaries working in the territory. It was not an easy journey, and the territory itself was a complicated and often painful thing to see. The evidence of removal and displacement visible in the faces of people who had been moved again and again from the land they knew to land that was given and then taken, and then given less. Grace found a woman who had known her mother, an elderly woman named Sally Bird, who was one of her mother's distant cousins, and who received them with a dignity that Amos respected deeply and recognized as the same quality he had first seen in Grace on a stage platform in 1882. Sally Bird told Grace things about her mother's early life that Grace had never known, and Grace listened and wept a little quietly, in the way she did everything. And James sat beside his mother and held her hand with the seriousness of a 9-year-old who understands that something important is happening even if he cannot fully name it. Clara sat across from Sally Bird and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and Sally Bird looked back and said something in Cherokee, and Grace translated it for Amos later. She said the child has the old blood in her eyes. On the last night before they headed back to Kansas, Grace sat outside the wagon in the spring dark with the firelight from Sally Bird's house a warm glow and the territory spread out around her, and Amos came and sat beside her and she leaned against him and they were quiet together for a long time. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said finally. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. She turned her face against his shoulder. "Do you know what I thought about when I was reading your notice for the first time?" "No," he said. "I thought, here is a man who is honest enough to put exactly what he wants in writing and put it in a window," she said. "And I thought, even if nothing else comes of it, that is a man worth knowing." "Something else came of it," he said. "Considerably more than something else," she agreed. He put his arm around her in the spring dark of the territory, with the children sleeping in the wagon and the firelight from Sally Bird's house warming the edge of the dark. And the sky above the territory was enormous and full of stars the way the Kansas sky was at Silver Horn. The same stars, the same sky, just a different piece of the long land. They drove back to Kansas 3 days later, with the wagon loaded with dried corn that Sally Bird had given them, and a beaded belt for James that he wore with such pride it was nearly painful to look at, and a shawl of deep red wool for Grace that Sally Bird had pressed into her hands at the last moment and said was her mother's, which Grace wore the whole journey home and then folded and put in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed, alongside the quilt Ruth had sent and the letters in the wooden box. The ranch was as they had left it when they pulled in at dusk on a Tuesday evening, Alejandro standing at the fence to meet them with the news that all was well, which was exactly what a man who can be trusted with a thing says when he is given a thing to be trusted with. Biscuit, who had stayed with Alejandro, made his slow old way out to the wagon and was received with the appropriate ceremony by both children. The years moved. James grew tall and had his father's square jaw and his mother's steady eyes, and an appetite for reading that kept Grace occupied finding him things worth reading. Clara grew into the stillness she had been born with and filled it with everything she observed, which was considerable, and she had her father's directness, and her mother's precision, and Sally Bird had been right about the eyes. They were their parents' children in the fullest sense, made of silver horn and letters and apple trees and a drought and a blizzard and a Cherokee woman's stories of how to read the sky. Alejandro's hair went white at the temples and he stayed at Silver Horn because it was his place as much as anyone's, and Amos told him once on a quiet evening on the porch that the ranch would not have been what it was without him, and Alejandro said, "The ranch would not be what it is without your wife, which she would tell you herself if you asked." And Amos said, "She tells me regularly," and Alejandro smiled the broad smile and said, "Good." The notice that Amos had put in Earl Donohue's window in the spring of 1882 stayed there for 2 weeks before Earl took it down, but the story of it had a longer life in Caldwell than any notice had a right to. Myrtle Donohue told it at ladies' meetings for years, the story of Amos Granger who wanted a plain woman, and the town sent him the most beautiful one they had, and how it had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to the Silver Horn Ranch, and probably to Amos Granger himself, though Myrtle said she would leave it to Grace to confirm the second part. Grace, when this was repeated to her, laughed with the full warmth of a woman who finds her own life genuinely funny in the best possible way, and said that she would be happy to confirm it, on the record, in any window notice Earl cared to display. On a warm evening in October of 1893, which was the 11th autumn since Grace Crawford had stepped off the afternoon stage in Caldwell, Kansas, with dust on the road behind her and a careful heart in her chest, she sat on the western porch of the Silver Horn Ranch house as the sun went down over 400 acres of grass and river and apple trees, and cattle moving slow and content through the far pasture. James was 12 now and long-legged and down in the barn with Alejandro learning the work that would one day be his if he wanted it. And Clara was 6 and sitting beside her mother on the porch with a book that was slightly too advanced for her, and that she was working through with the focused determination of a child who does not acknowledge the concept of too advanced. Amos came out from inside the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside Grace, and she took her cup, and their shoulders touched in the easy way of 2 people who have spent 11 years making a life together in the same space and have learned each other's gravity. The sky above the Kansas prairie was going gold and then rose, and then the deep layered crimson that happened sometimes in October when the air was dry and the horizon was clear, the kind of sky her mother had taught her to love and that she had taught her children to love in turn. "Clara," Amos said, "what does that sky tell you?" Clara looked up from her book and studied the sky with her grandmother's eyes and her father's methodical attention and said, "Clear and cold tonight. No rain for 3 days. The wind will come around to the north by morning." "Very good," Amos said. Clara went back to her book with the satisfaction of a child who has answered correctly. Grace looked at Amos over her coffee cup and he looked back at her, and between them passed the particular communication of 2 people who have been in love for long enough that some things no longer require words. The recognition, the warmth, the steady continuous fact of having chosen each other well and been proven right by 11 years of weather and work and children and apple trees and drought and blizzard, and everything the prairie had sent at them, and everything they had made of it. The sun went down, the sky went dark. The stars came out over Silver Horn in their thousands, the same stars that had always been there, over this land and all the land before it, over her mother's people and every person who had ever read the sky and drawn wisdom from it. Inside the house, the lamp burned gold in the window, warm and particular as a heartbeat, and the cedar chest sat at the foot of their bed with its quilt and its letters and its red wool shawl, and the wooden box of letters sat on the shelf where Grace had put it within the first week of her arrival, not hidden, just kept, because some things you put where you can find them when you need them. Biscuit slept at their feet on the porch, very old now and very peaceful, and the apple trees stood in the dark below the porch, bearing what they had been given time and love and proper tending to become, and the whole of the Silver Horn Ranch lay quiet and full and entirely itself in the October night. Grace Crawford, who had once been a schoolteacher alone in a rented room in Wichita with 2 trunks of belongings and a careful letter to write to a stranger, leaned her head against Amos Granger's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the world was steady and good and completely, permanently theirs.